Welcome to Keep Going, a podcast about failure and success, hosted by John Biggs. Every week, we talk to an amazing person about a time they failed and what they learned. And remember, when you're going through hell, keep going.
Welcome back to Keep Going, a podcast about success and failure. I'm John Biggs. Today on the show we have it's a bit different what we're going to be doing here, but we're going to be talking about Mechele Dickerson's work. She's a law professor at the University of Texas. Welcome, Ms. Dickerson.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So this is your new book is The Middle Class New Deal. And the reason why this sort of piqued my interest is that it would be super nice if we still had a middle class that had some economic clout. I feel that we don't, and I'm sure that you can tell us, you can give us the research behind that and why that's happening. But why don't you give us talk a little bit about the book?
So the book has been a labor of love. I know you sometimes have guests on that talk about failure, so I can tell you a pretty colossal story of my own failure as it involves this book. It is being published by the University of California Press, and I am delighted. But there was a bit of a failure before then. So I've been doing this research for a while. The first book that I wrote was on home ownership. And as I was sort of finishing that book, I kept thinking, something's going on with the middle class. It's not just that they can't buy homes, but they can't really do anything that we've historically associated with being the middle class. And so I started, digging deeper. And I thought, okay, I've got a book here, and I found a publisher. We will not name that publisher, but found a publisher. And then the premise of the book then and now is it is harder for lower and middle income people in this country to become and to remain middle class. It is particularly difficult if you are not a member of the white middle class. So that was the premise then, that's the premise now. So I'm sort of rolling along, everything's going well. And then the 2016 election comes. And we have this new sort of emphasis on middle class anger and middle class anxiety. And my thought was, well, that's true. There is a lot of middle class anxiety that's going on, but I don't think that's what we're seeing in this election. So I sort of rewrite the book, tweak it to sort of incorporate what we saw in the lead up to the 2016 election. And then I think I'm almost done. And then 2020 and COVID hits. And it's virtually impossible to write a book about the middle class and the struggles that they're facing if you don't incorporate the pandemic. So I had to rewrite the book the second time. And, I got suggestions from the old press and publishers and outside reviewers. And basically it was a disaster and they dumped me. And so then, here I am. I've spent a decade of my life working on this book. What do you do? And what I actually decided to do, they dumped me about this time, and I think it was 2023. And I decided what I was going to do was enjoy Thanksgiving and Christmas and not think about it. Came back the next spring and decided I like the idea that I've had. I still think I'm right. The pandemic has shown me some things. So I rewrote the book the third time and ended up with the publisher, and it's going to be coming out in January of 2026. So I failed colossally, but I think I'm back on track with a book that I really hope speaks to most of America and more importantly, speaks to politicians on both sides of the aisle.
So we talk a little about entrepreneurship here. And I think one of the lottery tickets that's always been in a middle class kid's mind is that I can create the next Twitter or Facebook, that sort of thing. What you're talking, and I also wanted to define some terms here. So you're talking about middle class between 75,000 and 130,000 per year, which is arguably in most major cities, that's probably not enough, but in the vast majority of the states, I think it's sufficient, right?
Right. And I picked that number for a reason. When I first started on this research, I would say middle class, and I would be speaking to a room full of law professors, and they'd start saying, yeah, we members of the, like, no, there is no we here. Law professors, we are not middle class. And so the number that I picked is actually, what a surprise coming from someone that teaches at a university. It's whatever number universities use to determine that they're going to give tuition breaks to the middle class. And I picked that number so that it will shift up each year. But you're absolutely right. What it takes to be middle class in Abilene, Texas, is measurably less than what it takes to be middle class in Austin, Texas.
So you discuss a little bit about this idea of the government passing laws or the government creating a system into which a middle class could flow. I can imagine. I'm thinking about my dad right now. He was the first person in his family to go to college, and this was late 50s, early 60s. And his parents to a degree were kind of middle class for that era, post-war, a GI Bill era. What defined middle class success then, and what defines middle class success now? And what are, I guess, the benefits that we're looking for in a true middle class?
I think very little has changed in terms of how we define middle class. In the book, I refer to them as the markers of the middle class. The big difference now is that it's virtually impossible for most lower and middle income families to attain those markers. So simple things. You talk about your dad in the GI Bill. So we had folks that came back from war, and the government recognized, politicians recognized, we have a lot of people coming back. The economy is barely recovered from the Depression. We need to do something to make sure that we don't have a back-to-back depression. So what do? They made it easier for people who wanted to go to college and get a degree. They made it easier for people to become homeowners. So before the Depression, it was virtually impossible to be a homeowner unless you came from wealth. So the homeownership rates then were fairly low. So the government created the 15 and the 30-year mortgage. Already companies had decided that, well, there's this wage freeze because of the war, but we can provide benefits. So we can give folks health insurance. We can give them a retirement plan. So one of the things that I found most frustrating as we watch the middle class evaporate in this country is the political view that, well, there's nothing that we can do about it. Well, we created the middle class in this country. And if we think the middle class is important, we need to do things to maintain or to recreate the middle class. The example I always use for why do we care about the middle class? Why are they so important? I use toaster ovens. So billionaires are only going to buy so many toaster ovens. If we think that stores want to be able to sell toaster ovens, refrigerators, any sort of appliance, we need to have a lot of people who can afford to buy them, because billionaires are only going to buy so many. And it's not that we want to look at human beings and say we want you to have economic stability simply because it benefits the U.S. economy. But if that's the way to get political leaders to actually care about restoring the middle class, then I'm perfectly happy to say it is in the economy's interest now, just as it was then, to make sure that we have a strong and vibrant middle class.
So I think that's went back to my original idea, this idea that the entrepreneur sees that as the lottery ticket, even to a degree of entering the middle class, because at this point you're dealing with folks who might not rank on that, may not be able to achieve those markers. To quite simply start a graphics design company and be successful at it allows you to potentially buy a home. I would say a major city, maybe an Abilene would let you get a home earlier, but it feels like you basically have to do a scratch off to make sure that to get any one of those markers that you described. Your family has to have a scratch off, or you have to have a scratch off to get a good college education, because you have to be lucky. To get a house at this point, you have to be lucky. All these things to be lucky. Am I making that up? Is that an actual thing? Did your research back that up? And what are we doing to fix it?
No, you're absolutely right. And so one of each of the book chapters sort of looks at where things should be with the middle class and where they aren't. So I talk about college. The cost of college have increased since the 1980s at a rate that far outpaces inflation. So when we hear about the student loan crisis, it's because unless your parents happen to have wealth, you may struggle to be able to afford to go to college, and particularly to go to some of the sort of elite colleges, but even some of the flagship colleges in most states. We used to have needs blind admissions policies at most colleges, so they didn't consider whether or not you could afford to go there. They admitted you first without considering whether you had financial need. A lot of colleges have moved away from that. We used to mostly give financial aid at colleges based on your family's need. Now we have a whole range of things called merit scholarships, which are basically a way to say, how can we get money to the children of rich people so that we discount their tuition a little bit, but they can still afford to pay a lot. and they can certainly pay more than a poor family would. Well, a college education shouldn't be the key to becoming middle class, but that's what it's become. And so if employers are using a bachelor's degree as the cutoff, or their algorithms now, since so much is done online, if you can't even get your foot in the door of a decent job without a college degree, what that means is a lot of folks are going to have to go to college, and it's costing them more. To buy a home now, I think the average age of home ownership is now 40. Last week, a couple of weeks ago, we heard this horrible notion that we're going to have a 50-year mortgage. Well, back in the day, that was called rent. And so if you were telling somebody that it's going to take you 50 years to own a home, that's making a lot of assumptions. First, you better buy that home pretty early, because if you buy it at the age of 40, you may not be here in 50 to finally pay off that mortgage. And so if you don't get a college degree, you don't get a good job with benefits, you may never be able to buy a home. And to your point, in terms of being an entrepreneur, if you don't have access to capital, so your family doesn't come from wealth, you don't own a home that you can borrow against, I'm ambivalent as to whether or not people should be putting their shelter at risk at the same time they're trying to launch a business. But even if we assume that that's something that may make sense for some entrepreneurs, you've got to own the home. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for young people in particular to be able to afford to buy a home.
I think that was an interesting point about the markers, is that I think the most urban cores, I guess you could say, like I was just in Chicago, for example, New York, you could argue, like you could argue at Dallas. They feel like they've kind of priced out almost every single person, and they're catering to a much higher than middle class group. Can we fix cities to a degree? A city that doesn't have the sorts of, I guess, stratification as like a New York, can we fix a Dallas with all of its suburbs and encourage home ownership in the exurbs, I suppose, and good jobs in the exurbs? What are some of the government things what are some of the things that I guess we can do and the government could do to encourage the same kind of thing, where there was a white collar job in Wheeling, West Virginia, where there are none now?
Well, there's two things, and I'll say one at the local level. So in a lot of cities, the zoning regulations make it virtually impossible for builders to affordably construct multifamily housing. So if the zoning laws say that you can't put anything on this lot that's smaller than 3,000 square feet, well, that sort of tells you the types of homes that are going to be built in a lot of suburban neighborhoods. In almost all neighborhoods that are wealthy, you're going to have some sort of a homeowners association. And, I'll sort of joke, their goal is to keep poor and middle income people out. And so they have the rules and the regulations that are designed, and they'll say it's to preserve the value of the homes. And I'll take them.
So the cynic in me says that it's almost impossible to recreate that GI Bill style trajectory, right? I remember distinctly my grandparents owned their home. They lived in Martins Ferry, Ohio, which is currently right in the meth belt of Ohio, on the West Virginia border. My cousins had pools in the backyard. They had big screen TVs. They had a few cars, and this was all on a steelworker's salary, or on a uncle was a car dealership. And it felt like everybody was comfortable. Everybody was well fed. Everybody was happy, to as much as you could be in that situation. And I don't think that's possible anymore. Is it possible? Can we go back to those halcyon days? Myrtle Beach. Does this fix polarization? I don't know. Insurgent democracy, the stuff that gave us Trump in the first place. Well, this has been wonderful, and this is stuff that's been bothering me actually since that trip to Chicago. This feeling that this urban core that used to be for everybody, used to be front window at Gimbel's used to be full of Red Riders or BB guns and stuff, halcyon days, is no longer that way, and it didn't feel right. So I think this really crystallizes that for me. So the new book is The Middle Class New Deal: Restoring Upward Mobility in the American Dream. It's coming out January 26th. So by the time this podcast comes out, I think you'll be able to probably pick it up. So thank you for joining us. This has been Keep Going. I'm John Biggs. We'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to Keep Going, a podcast about success and failure. Remember, Keep Going is entirely listener-supported. If you're listening to this, please head over to keepgoingpod.com, where you can subscribe to the podcast for as little as $5 a month. This is a labor of love, and every little bit helps. Thanks for listening.